Hey Animal Allies, I'm Michelle. Welcome to another episode of the Animal Liberation Hour, where we seek insight from animal rights activists to inspire us to fight for animals worldwide. My guest on this pod is Jonathan Dickstein, professor of vegan studies at Arihanta Institute. A little bit about Animal Activism Collective. AAC was created to galvanize activists by equipping them with the tools, community, and resources they need to fully participate in our global animal liberation movement. Our core goal is to eradicate the normalization of violence and oppression against all sentient beings by growing a culture of empathy and compassion. We do this through mentorship, education, support, and multi-pronged activism. Please visit our website and follow us on YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook, and reach out to us to apply to become a mentor or mentee. So now to our guest. Jonathan Dickstein PhD is a professor of Jain and vegan studies at Arihanta Institute, specializing in South Asian religions, religion and ecology, and comparative religious ethics. He received his doctoral degree in religious studies from the University of California, Santa Barbara, where he wrote his dissertation on ancient Indian animal taxonomies and their relevance for religious ritual and dietary practice. Jonathan's current work focuses on Jainism and contemporary ecological issues, and accordingly extends into critical animal studies and food studies. Our deep conversation covered the nature of Ahimsa, the path of nonviolence, how Jainism views veganism, tips for street outreach with folks from various religious backgrounds, the spiritual nature of animals, and much more. Please enjoy my conversation with Jonathan. Hey, Jonathan, welcome to the Animal Liberation Hour.
Thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
So you are focused on animal studies and vegan studies and religious studies and ethics as a professor and author and researcher. Our audience is poised to learn so much from you. So let's start with, what is your animal activist or animal advocate origin story? When and why, in other words, did you start standing up for oppressed animals?
Yeah, that's a great question. I often actually ask that question to folks that I'm interviewing. I often say, when did you get radicalized for animals? Meaning, when did you actually start to see the issue and then decide that somehow it needed to be part of your life? Without maybe giving the extremely long story, I grew up in Northeast Philadelphia, mostly with a single mom and who was working full time. And I spent most of my childhood eating fast food, eating standard American diet, fast food, had pets, would go to the petting zoo, love these animals, but absolutely could go to the petting zoo, look at the animals, and then come home and maybe be eating those same animals not long thereafter. So I think this is a common story. Some people have different backgrounds, but for me, it was just completely not a thing, right? The obscuration of animals in our society, even when we sometimes get glimpses of them. And even later on, when I went to college and I was studying philosophy, and even when we were learning about animals, at least somewhat, it still never really registered with me, really at all. But I have to say also, I think things come on our radar when what we're around socially. What is the social norms we're around? And I tell people I didn't meet a vegetarian until I was like in my third year of college. And I'm not saying vegan, I'm saying a vegetarian, someone who told me they were vegetarian the first time I actually met someone. And that's about 20 years old. You're approaching 20 years old before you meet someone. Granted, this is a couple decades ago. And then I met someone who's vegan. It just seemed like an anomaly. I didn't know anything other than they ate a lot of French fries. College students just ate a lot of French fries. And then I think it really went off the radar for me. I just wasn't really concerned. I was still very much interested in philosophy. And after I finished my undergraduate degree, I kind of wanted to get more involved in somatic practices, so body-related practices. I was a little exhausted with simply reading, writing, thinking. So over the years, I got involved in yoga communities, and specifically what we might call like postural yoga. I mean, what Elizabeth de Michaelis refers to as modern postural yoga. It's kind of MPY. And meditation, yoga communities I was involved in all throughout, say, the 2000s a bit. And, it still didn't really come onto my radar. Eventually, in the late 2000s, I became vegetarian, but it was mostly because I just kind of thought that's what you did. Honestly, I didn't really consult many other yoga practitioners, but I, you know, heard it enough. Some teachers were talking about vegetarianism around me. I had learned about nonviolence. And so I have to say, I wasn't really so motivated by compassion towards animals at that moment as just kind of doing what I thought was conducive to this practice. Then, the challenges is as like internet. I mean, a lot of my story before is really like pre-internet boom, but then late 2000s, everyone's still right online. And the more you search vegetarianism, the more you search nonviolence, you start to get vegan content. And I think not too long thereafter, at the end of the 2000s, is when I decided, like, okay, well, if I'm doing this one thing, I really should just also eliminate these other items as well. I still wasn't doing advocacy, I wasn't doing activism, but what did happen was that around that time, I wanted to start talking about these issues in yoga communities because I thought it was very relevant because it's where I'd learned them. But it was surprising to me that I found out that a lot of the people around me not only weren't vegan, but certainly weren't vegetarian at all. And it was extremely difficult to even have the conversation. And we can talk about why later on if we like. And part of my motivation to go into graduate school, quite, over 10 years after I finished my undergraduate, was because I wanted to learn Sanskrit. I wanted to learn Indian philosophy. I wanted to learn directly from texts, understand these issues, and ideally bring them back to the yoga and meditation communities and say, look, actually, if you look at the text or if you look at the philosophy itself, it really points us in these directions. And it was around the time that I was doing my master's at CU Boulder that I got in contact with some undergraduate students that were there. What was their group called? Something very charming, like the Vegan Justice League or something like this at CU Boulder.
Mm-hmm.
So undergraduate group, which sounds really charming, but they weren't just advocates and they weren't just vegans hanging out, but they were young in their 20s, but starting to get involved in activism. And actually, as people who follow a lot of the history of, say, groups like Direct Action Everywhere, a lot of them were in Colorado early on, and a lot of the people there were getting involved, and also in Berkeley, obviously. But this is where I like met a lot of the people who would later on maybe join that org, other orgs, leave those orgs, whatever. But actually learning from these younger students were really the ones that motivated me that, hey, like I also can do what I consider this academic work and in my personal life and do what I do in the yoga studios. But what about street activism? What about street advocacy?
Mm-hmm.
So I'd say that from around 2012, so I'm a bit like late to the game. I mean, some of us are much later, but we all kind of get exposed and are affected at different times. I'd say since around 2012, 13, I started being involved in more street activism. And since then, I've continued to do things like that and advocacy, education. I was there in Colorado when Love and Arms Animal Sanctuary was really just getting started. I do some academic work on their sanctuary. And I'd say, since then, I've done all kinds of things. I've been at conferences. I've been involved in direct action events, in street education and advocacy. Certainly not as much as many. I've been also maintaining kind of an academic life at the same time, but I try to do quite a bit of both.
Mm. Absolutely. I didn't realize you had such a long history in activism and so many various experiences. And so, as you're already pointing to the overlap between veganism and activism, and I want to talk more about the yoga community and about Ahimsa, but the sort of evolving definition of veganism in your mind, I believe you sort of define it as a practice and a belief system. Obviously, we always say it's not a diet, all of that. But can you just maybe for folks who are a little newer, in your own words, define veganism in your broader, more holistic context?
Yes, and I will just specify that I actually have written two pieces with co-authors. One is a piece called "The Ism of Veganism" that I've published with Jan Dutkiewicz. Another is "Veganism as Left Praxis" with Jan and also uh, Jishnu Majumdar Guha and Drew Winter. And we actually don't define it as such. My understanding, which came to me after a number of years, was that I actually use veganism as a purely conduct descriptive term. So what I mean by that is I refer to veganism as the practice of, probably have the formal definition written somewhere, but just it's the practice of non-use and consumption of animals and animal products. I tend to, yes, I think that's a pretty sufficient term. And it's ironically, I mean, this is what you look up in the like Oxford Dictionary. I bet you that's what it actually says. I think there's still maybe the longstanding practice of doing the kind of philosophy and way of life or practice philosophy way of life in the article, especially the ism of veganism that I've written. I don't find that to be convincing. I personally don't find it convincing to talk about kind of veganism in a philosophical sense because I think we have other terms that do capture it more accurately. And when the term was founded right in the 40s with the Vegan Society, as many people know, I think those terms didn't exist. And honestly, I really do think that we've developed the movement, we've developed our language, we've developed the terminology that I think veganism kind of struggles to do this duty of being like a practice and a philosophy and an ethic and a way of life. It just becomes too big where I feel like it loses its specificity. But just to wrap that up, I think we can tell what's the most palatable and understandable definition is that if someone on the street asked you, um, if you're vegan, what they pretty much refer to is, do you consume and use animals and animal products? And not long ago, someone asked me about that. And the minute I said I was vegan, they said, why? And it was interesting to me is because that actually illuminated the point in my mind that the why, I can't just say because veganism, right? They wanted to know why, so it had to be something else.
Mm.
And so what I view is that I tend to view that veganism refers to the what, and the why is another question. I know a lot of people don't agree with me about that, and I'm certainly open to that conversation, but that's the place where I'm at right now.
Yeah, no, I like that. It sort of decomplicates it a bit, demystifies it a bit, and is appealing to the average person, I suppose we could say. And I'll make sure that we put the titles of those papers or articles in the show notes so people can access them. Yes, anybody can access them, the public. So we'll make
I
sure.
think so. Some of them, and folks, if you include my email, can always contact me directly. I'd be happy to supply them.
Perfect, perfect. So let's tie that into Ahimsa, our understanding, your understanding of Ahimsa. At the heart of approaching veganism is the principle, I guess you call it a principle of Ahimsa. Can you translate Ahimsa? What is the deeper definition and significance of Ahimsa? Where does it come from? And what hopeful promise does Ahimsa offer as an ethical path or a way?
So it's a complicated question about ahimsa. So just superficially, ahimsa refers to non-harming. If we were going to translate it, I think the best terminology or the best rendering is non-harming. And so ahimsa is violence, is a negation, ahimsa, just like theism, atheism. In Sanskrit, we also have that. So, like another term you sometimes hear is non-stealing, asteya, it's asteya. Steya is thieving, stealing, asteya, non-stealing. So, primarily, it's an abstention. And I think that's key. Primarily.
Hmm.
This is similar to the way actually veganism operates too, right? It's fundamentally an abstention. And it's an abstention, as I said, from harming. Now, I'm talking more theoretically now, not historically, but what actually constitutes harming is actually not an easy question to answer. When we talk about himsa, or we talk about suffering, which the word dukkha, or I translate as unpleasantness, is often used. What that is actually hard to define. Is it physical, emotional, psychological? Is it subjective? Is it objective? So all those more tricky philosophical questions aside, pretty much all Indian thinkers and I think Western thinkers would say that, say, acts of extreme, like say physical injury, harm, um, discomfort, deprivation,
Mm,
uh, things that cause negative experiences that we at least can all agree upon,
mm,
constitute forms of harm. And ahimsa is non-harming, avoiding that as much as possible. Complete abstention being the horizon point or this kind of aspiration.
mm,
I'm going to come back to that point in a second. Historically, what we find is that the term originally, I'm going to try not to give too long, but when we're talking about, say, in the Indian context, in the first millennium BCE, so 1,000 years before the Common Era, we have early on what's known as the kind of Vedic period. And this is something like Hinduism doesn't exist, Buddhism doesn't exist, Jainism doesn't exist. And uh, Vedism or Vedic traditions refer to those who follow the Veda, which are these kind of authoritative texts that individuals who are said to have migrated into India, what is now India, kind of brought with them these oral texts. And there was a lot of sacrifice involved, there was a lot of ritual practice involved. And you see in these texts mentions of ahimsa, but it really doesn't refer to imsa, as you said, as a principle. It's really kind of ways to avoid forms of negligence, I'd say, or ill effects in the wrong performance of a sacrifice. It's not talking really about, it's talking about ill effects for the person who's performing the sacrifice. However, in the middle of this millennium is when the historical Buddha lives and the founder of Jainism, Mahavira, lives. And there are other individuals who seem to be from kind of not Buddhist or not Jain, but from these Vedic traditions who are starting to have a more philosophical approach to religiosity and spirituality. And these groups seem to, at this point in like mid first millennium, seem to develop this notion of ahimsa, of non-harming. They believe that actually the causing of harm to other beings for whatever reasons, such as the kind of karmic retribution and so on, is to be avoided. And it's primarily focused a lot at animal sacrifice, the harm that they see being committed in animal sacrifice. Later on, this gets developed by the Buddhists, by Jains, by classical yoga traditions. I think a lot of Westerners first come into the notion through maybe their classical exposure to classical yoga. And then also, we obviously saw it then later on through people like Gandhi, but Gandhi gets it from the Jain background, the Jain kind of environment in which he was brought up. And then it gets translated as nonviolence. First, before I get back to that other point that I said I was going to come back to, is that I don't translate it as nonviolence, not only because it seems to confuse us with the political projects that people like Martin Luther King and Gandhi were involved in,
mm,
but I think it's inaccurate to conflate the two, to say that all acts of harm are acts of violence. Because I can unintentionally cause harm,
mm,
but it'd be odd to call it violence. I can intentionally cause harm, and it would be odd to call it violence. For example, I can knowingly give a vaccination to my child, and I know that it's going to hurt them. But I think you would agree it's strange to call that violence,
mm,
right? But it's not strange to say that I've intentionally harmed them in a way, right? What could be the kind of, the recovery from that is, well, okay, and violence involves the, say, intentional infliction of harm without any form of benefit to the person who's harmed or any kind of compensatory benefit, right? I'm not doing it for their own interests. And then we might start to get to what violence is. But just to kind of wrap up this part, what I said earlier about ahimsa being aspirational, I had a wonderful conversation from Shailene Shah, who was one of the co-founders of Love and Arms. And I think he expressed the point rightly. He said, we're trying to get people to live a vegan way of life, but an ahimsic way of life is way beyond that. Veganism is only part of it. But really, how do you live a life infused with ahimsa that that goes even beyond that? And I think that's extremely important to understand that even if you practice veganism, there are so many other areas in which you're complicit in harm, actively involved in harm, and can apply the principle there as well.
Wow, I love that. So, as we, see where the intersection is between all these various Eastern paths, spiritual paths, and veganism, and where it's missing, and where there is talk about veganism. And I know you've written extensively about all of this, and as we go, I would love to talk about yoga a bit more, and Buddhism and Hinduism, and I know Jainism is your main focus of study as well. But, yoga has become so popular, became popular in the West a while ago now, but it's been kind of despiritualized, and, it's in the gyms and thought of more, the physical part of it as an exercise. So how can do we want to appeal? Are they low-hanging fruit, the folks who are yoga practitioners, or it's really just too individual, case by case. Um, so most yoga practitioners are not vegan. Say again, like what is the blind spot and where does veganism intersect with yoga philosophy and practices?
It's a great question. Before that, I would like to just flag so much of the great literature that is going on in modern yoga studies. I've kind of been out of it for a little bit, but people like Amanda Lucia, who wrote White Utopias, Andrea Jane's Selling Yoga, even Chris Miller from Arihanta Institute's Embodying Transnational Yoga, Mark Singleton's The Yoga Body that many people have read are really wonderful books to understand how, and I'm sorry for missing several others right now, but really to understand how modern yoga is what it is and where it's come from and the kind of discourse it traffics in, whether it's about the physical or non-physical and so on, and what their lineages are. I mean, I myself spent a long time in yoga communities, in Iyengar yoga communities. And the book I referenced earlier, or Elizabeth D. Michaelis, who I referenced, her book, A History of Modern Yoga, talks a lot about Iyengar yoga. And just, it's a wonderful book in seeing how Indian teachers themselves come to the US and are the ones who are oftentimes teaching yoga in the ways that right now we think are the ways that Americans have somehow kind of taken it from India and reshaped it. Yes, that has also happened, but it's a flow. They were both affecting one another in this kind of mutually transforming process. Now, also as a note before I kind of answer your question about at least my experience in yoga communities is for your listeners, really the Jains are the original like Ahimsa people. They are the original Ahimsa community. They are the longest enduring vegetarian community in the world, almost 2,500 years. And they are, to use the slogans we see in the movement, they are the original kind of vegetarian for the animals, right? You look at the history of American vegetarianism or European vegetarianism, and it's very much health related early on. In my view, the relationship of vegetarianism or even veganism to health, at least what you see, or at least as yoga practices or meditation practices to physical health, those are relatively new phenomenon, right? For the Jains, they're not kind of being vegetarians primarily, historically at least, because of the positive health effects. And we can talk about it more but once you understand the kind of the Jain worldview and the goal of life and its kind of liberation ethic, the goal of life really isn't to have this like robust physical body that lives the longest, that is attractive, that is strong, that can satisfy desires. I mean, I'm being a little general here because it depends which Jains we're talking about. But if we're talking from a spiritual perspective, the goal isn't really about maximizing the body and its experiences and its pleasure satisfaction, right? The Buddhists also have long known this. This is why, the Buddhists, the second noble truth is what's the source of suffering is desire or thirst, trishna. because desire will never be satiated. It will just give birth to new desires. So I just really implore individuals who don't know much about Jainism to at least look into it. I mean, their slogan is Ahimsa Paramo Dharma, right? Nonviolence or non-harming is the highest duty, right? This is their kind of, talk to Jains, if they had one line, this is really what they would repeat. So if those who are interested in kind of individual changes in their lives for owing to harms or cognizance of the harms you commit specifically towards sentient beings. I mean, the Jains have been dialed in on this for millennia. Now, as for yoga communities, it's really hard. I don't say it all the time, but it's also hard to know which yoga communities, yoga communities, which ones. Just like Jains, I'm saying Jains, but it also makes sense to say which Jains. Lay people, monastics, men, women in India, outside of India, where outside of India, where inside of India. But I can't give those qualifiers every time. Nevertheless, in the yoga community, I do find that because it's become mostly an individual wellness community, that's really very, to use the term, kind of like navel-gazy in orientation. And this idea that I can't really like be good for the world until I'm good with myself has, I think, made the yoga community a very hard community to penetrate with respect to animal rights and veganism, because most individuals, as you know it, even outside of that community, view these as infringements on their autonomy, on their ability to self-care, on their ability to be well. And while there is some truth to that, I think the question we can always ask is, well, like, how far can that be taken? I mean, I could do all kinds of things for the sake of, say, maximizing my well-being. I can hoard wealth. I can be untruthful. I can do all kinds of things with respect to others that in some way are benefiting me and are on kind of my own path. But the question is, does that path ever end? And I think in the yoga communities, individuals spend lots of time debating very philosophical points or getting really interested in the intricacies of breathing practices and physical practices, which I don't denounce. But given how much talk there is about the ethics, non-harming, especially don't cause harm to yourself, I have still found it surprising that the minute you start to talk about the routine harm we commit towards animals and also the humans embedded in the animal industrial complex, it is still striking how much this tends to fall on deaf ears within most yoga communities. From my experience, I know there's a lot of other stories. I know a lot of people who practice who are vegan, but I know a lot of people who have left these communities, Buddhist communities, specifically because there seemed to have no space for it.
Yeah, and your experience is very valuable to me and to our listeners. Even if it's your personal experiences and your personal, stories that you're sharing with us, they are extremely valuable and definitely give us a glimpse of a bit of a microcosm into that. But it's making me think about, I'm wondering where you land with vegetarians in terms of, there's always a back and forth sometimes in the activists community about whether to give vegetarians a pass because they're vegetarians or whether to lean into letting them know that they're not really saving animals because they're still consuming dairy and eggs and honey and those things. So, in terms of having conversations with vegetarians, especially vegetarians who identify as spiritual, and maybe we come across them in yoga communities and Buddhist communities. And do you feel, that vegetarian is more helpful or harmful? And I know there's no right or wrong exact answer with that. And how can we respectfully have these conversations?
There's a few questions. I mean, the last question
I know I throw these
is really
big questions.
the last question is really the overarching question that has nothing to do particularly with vegetarianism in general. How
Yes.
do we have good conversations? And with whom? And what's the point? What's the point of having conversations with person A over person B?
Mm.
So I think a very interesting question individuals can ask themselves, and I think this is common to a lot of conversation and even street advocacy is, are we talking principles or are we talking practicality? Are you asking the question is vegetarianism, say, a legitimate and consistent praxis with respect to, say, one's views on animals,
Mm.
right? By and large, we'll say no, right? Let's even say we don't even have to address whether or not uh, non-lethal uses of animals or talking about pets. We can shelf that for the moment and just talk about kind of like mainstream, okay, animal extraction industries, right? It'd be hard for me to find individuals who would think that these places should exist. Now, that's a question on principle. And are you having a conversation about with someone on principles, whether or not non-meat products are acceptable to, say, produce and consume? That's one conversation. But just if you convince someone of your point who's a vegetarian, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to change anything that they do in their life. So what did you do? You won the debate. Good job. So now it seems to be more about you and whether or not you're right. I walked away, I did my job. I showed them that their view was wrong. I mean, you see this on the internet all the time, right? Like, watch how this vegan owns this other people, this meat eater in the debate, or defeats them in the debate.
Mm.
Okay, great. What does that do actually? Did that meat eater leave and change anything about their life? Did they feel heard? Did they feel respected? Did they feel like they would be welcomed into a community? Probably not. So I'm sensitive to, if we're talking practicality, then is the key for someone who's a vegetarian to berate them? Is that really your target audience, to berate them? So instead, how can you engage with them? That is, maybe if you want to know someone in your life who's vegetarian and maybe vegetarian for a long time, and you want to kind of show the problems with milk, um, eggs, honey, other non-meat products, can you have a conversation informed by things like social science and psychology where you actually listen to them and you ask them questions and you ask them to talk about their values and you ask them to talk about what they do and you listen to them, and maybe you don't even talk about veganism in the first conversation, maybe hardly ever, but you start to kind of breadcrumb, or you start to drip in other ideas that incrementally, as we all know, people have to come to the decision themselves. I mean, you talk to Sarah, right, from Lancaster Farm Sanctuaries, worked in addiction. She'll say people have to come to it on their own. You can't just tell them to stop doing drugs or stop drinking. No matter what kind of PowerPoint you put together to show them all the reason why it's hurting their life and those around them, it's just not in line with what we know about individual change and social change. So this is what I say is like, are you doing advocacy to make you feel better, to make you feel less helpless, which I feel are reasonable? That's fine. But if when you're actually engaged in certain forms of advocacy, on the street activism, anonymous for the voiceless stuff, things like this, are you calling people in or are you calling them out? Right.
Mm.
And ideally, we should be calling these people in, saying, look, I hear you. I understand that's hard. I understand where you come from. And then somehow still be able to share our own perspective. And I'll just end on that because I think Vasile Stanescu, who has taught for us at Arihanta, I will amplify what he says all the time, which is we're all victims. We're all victims in a certain way. And I don't mean equally victims. I mean we're all victims of a certain form of propaganda, of conditioning, of upbringing. And it seems, in my mind, I don't want to just say absurd, but also quite disrespectful to think that because you were able to have a certain transformation on a certain path, now it gives you license to go around and kind of call people out because you too were a victim at one point. you too weren't able to listen to these things and you had to get to a point. So, I would implore people to use the tactics such as radical compassion, radical patience with individuals, and slowly help them come to this realization. And we can talk about it more. I know individuals will say, but no, it's so urgent. There's so many animals need us right now, right? And I think absolutely right. I will be the last person, read anything I've written, I'll be the last person to trivialize the situation of animals. But I don't know if going in conversations with a hammer actually helps that, even if internally it feels like it's what we have to do.
Yeah, so then I'd love to get your thoughts on, when we are having those outreach conversations or just informal conversations about veganism and animal liberation, and folks will bring up their religion of origin, what they're currently practicing, what, their religious belief system is. And we know in our minds they're sort of using as an excuse, a way to shut down the conversation, a reason for not being vegan. And I know, should we ever use the word or even hint to the word hypocrisy or hypocrite, or should we, because those are hot button words, certainly, that will make people defensive, but they are used, they are used. We see them used. Is there a better way, a better word, how to respectfully confront when someone refers to their religion as a reason for not being vegan? Because we hear it all the time. I'm dot 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 religion, and my religion says it's
Mhm.
okay, or just this is not okay, or if they're killed this way. Yeah. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, have you ever been, Michelle, yourself, have you ever been shamed into change? Has that
No,
ever worked effectively on you?
that has not worked. That does not work for me. No.
Um, I don't know many people at all it's worked for. I know that there's a few people I know for a long time that after a while I'd ask, like, so, like, why aren't you vegan? We have all these conversations. You do other amazing activist work, advocacy work, and they might respect that. They might change or they might not change. But I certainly wasn't like, wow, you're concerned for liberation over here, but you're not over here. You're a hypocrite. So I cease to understand the utility of that whatsoever. And I'm going to say, I'll repeat it again a few times. It seems to be more about us than it has to do about them, calling someone out as a hypocrite. If you know it, or if you think that, that's one thing. But what actual work is being done by you calling the person that? Is there some illusion that once they're called a hypocrite, they realize that and they realize that the goal of their life is to live in absolute consistency across the board and they will change everything
Right.
right away?
Yeah.
I like the phrase Naisargi Dave, who's an anthropologist, who's wonderful, wonderful researcher and writer at University of Toronto, talks about the tyranny of consistency, especially in vegan kind of advocacy. It's just like, when can I catch some person in some inconsistency? But you know what? I can catch vegans in all kinds of inconsistencies in the rest of their lives, what they do with respect to, say, fossil fuels or hoarding wealth or investments or other things that they engage in that are extremely harmful to animals, but not in the kind of billboard ways that the main category ways. So that's the question. I don't see the usefulness of using that kind of language. Once again, I would say, okay, so how can I approach this person where they are, where they're coming from? And before we even do that, we have to look at what's the tradition they're coming from. Are they talking about a historically, say, marginalized, discriminated against, and oppressed and violated ethnic group or religious group?
Mm.
Are you talking about, say, Muslims in America who's talking about Islam and talking about how much Islamophobia, how much racism, how much ethnocentrism, how much white supremacy affects their religious affiliation and
Mm.
the practices that they're involved in? Then I would be doing such a disservice by acting like, oh, you're just using something as an excuse. Because this is essentially who they are. It's their community, it's their family, it's their survival group, as it were. So I think there's a lot of people who do work in religion and animals who then say, okay, well, and not all of us are, and I think activists are probably not really well read or informed about, say, Islam, so they don't know how to speak from Islam. So then they'll just have recourse to you're just using that as an excuse like any other tradition, right? But I think if you want to talk to people who are actually quite religious, who think that what is said in religious texts or by religious authorities is truth, which I think is obviously questionable on its own. When someone cites the Bible, the idea that this is some indisputed truth is obviously suspect and rejected by vast numbers of people. But if you want to talk about something on their own terms, okay, what are the values within those traditions? Most religious traditions, at least from my understanding, don't require you to kill and eat animals. It's not a requirement, right? It might go against the grain and you might face some stigmatization and marginalization from within the communities. I mean, Black vegans and Black vegan writing talks about this all the time, the way in which they're kind of stigmatized within their own communities. Um, and not that I'm ever, not that I'm ever really that sympathetic towards the way men live in society or cis men because they have so much privilege, but there is this way in which, right, becoming vegan all of a sudden stigmatizes you as being less this thing or being more feminine and so on, which is obviously a problem because it's like the patriarchal norm of acting like being more feminine is somehow a step down, but that's like a separate conversation. Yeah, my point would be that what are the values? How can you listen to people who are within any religious tradition talk about their values, their religious values, talk about their home life, how they grew up, maybe they had animals they lived with, maybe they cared for animals, and say like, yeah, I'm talking about the same things. You could share that as an advocate. Yeah, this is also what motivates me. Just like in your tradition, I also feel compassion very deeply. I understand its validity. I also understand that there are extenuating circumstances.
Hmm.
But I think this kind of idea that people are just making excuses, people are selfish, they're just motivated by taste or price, I think I mean, this could be part of our conversation, far underestimates the significance of food, habit, um, community, family. And I think it's very disrespectful, and this is why people I think get extremely offensive when anything someone says is reduced to you're just making an excuse, you just want to eat the food you want to eat, you're some like glutton, selfish hypocrite. I don't know when that's going to change anybody's mind.
No, more likely they'll put more walls up,
Absolutely.
you know, putting ourselves in their position. And so, what I take away from what you said is like, circling back to open-ended questions and being generally curious, this like the Socratic method. So, questions maybe like, what are the values of your religion and traditions? Or what is the essence? If you could boil it down, like, what is the essence of your belief system? And then see if there were likely correlations to kindness and compassion, which is really at the heart, and non-use, non-harming, non-violence, which is at the heart of veganism. And that as well, there likely aren't light bulb moments for people, like a one moment where it's just gonna open their eyes, wake them up in such a way that we say it would be nice in an ideal world, but it's, as you said, it's gradual and it's planting seeds and putting breadcrumbs to have them come to their own conclusions is some of what we do.
Absolutely. And I also find that there's a way in which, whether or not these individuals know it or not, and at least consciously, there's a way in which the animal rights movement historically has been, and also dominantly still is, um, populated by largely a certain type of person, which is not everyone, but it's usually some kind of middle class, white advocate, activist, and so on. Obviously, this is not the entire demographic. But individuals who you meet could say, okay, that's great, but it seems like you've chosen, and I think this is a fair criticism, like you've chosen this little niche topic that's going to be your pet activism. And you think that it's valid because you don't eat certain things. Wow, wow, the buy-in was so small because it is a small buy-in, honestly, for vegans, for them to feel like they're socially involved, right? Wow, all you do is you don't consume animal products. And so I think that what would be, if people who do, I mean, I mean, I've talked about kind of vegans and animal rights activists interchangeably. I mean, I find them to be fundamentally different. But if in either case, if the critique from vegans and animal-centric, say, advocates is that, wow, all of these other people who are against oppression don't care about animals. Well, how about the people who care about animals? What are they doing for other groups? What are they doing, say, against the prison system or the police system? What are they doing for Palestinian liberation? What are they doing for trans rights? What are they doing for disability issues? And so, if you actually want to show people for whom animals are completely off the radar, and that's another conversation, is people just don't forget how normalized animal use and harm is, their invisibility in plain sight, that once you can convince people that actually, look, this is part of my overall ethos, like I actually also care about the systemic discrimination and violence towards these human groups. But what I've also realized is that it is interwoven with and gestures to this massive evil committed against animals, then I think it becomes more legible. And that's a theoretical point. I think it's borne out by research as well, but also anecdotally, it has been in my life, it has shown itself to be true that people I know who are very concerned about social justice issues um, very much listen to and respect my work for animals, the more they know that I am extremely interested in what's happening in these human justice issues. Um, Not just because of the ramifications for animals, like, say, the way exploited labor works in slaughterhouses. Like, obviously, slaughterhouses are awful on their own. Automating slaughterhouses would not solve the issue, but the exploitation of labor and the types of people who do that labor should be a concern of vegans and non-vegans alike.
Mm.
Right? Don't use exploited labor to get people to be vegetarian or vegan because you care about animals and it's like a Trojan horse. You want to tell them about exploited labor so that they boycott slaughterhouses, but really you were just using that because they wouldn't accept the animal arguments. Because if you're a vegan and animal rights person, you don't care independently about exploited labor, whether it's in the slaughterhouse or in the strawberry field, then that is a big issue. And like you said, that is a moment of hypocrisy itself.
Absolutely.
Pointed back, pointed backwards.
Yeah, it's a huge disconnect, misalignment in that way. So thank you for again pointing out that intersectionality and then exploitation, human and non-human exploitation serves no one, serves
Mhm.
none of us, nobody. Nobody's left out of that fabric or that field of oppression and
Yeah.
violence. So can we segue from that to another big topic, but we'll sort of touch on the spiritual life of animals, that animals have a spiritual life,
Mhm.
spiritual purpose, dare we say, as individuals, all their own. And then I want to talk about Arihanta Institute as well, where people can go to learn more about pretty much everything that we're talking about
Mhm.
today. They can get more serious about their diving into these topics. So then my first question, I have a few, and you'll sit if you want to answer them. Do animals, in your belief, have souls, or are they souls? We could say it either way, right? And how did you form that belief?
So I'll answer with the question to you is when you say soul, what are you thinking of?
Well, basically, a non-physical intelligence, a non-physical essence that is infinite, that continues beyond death, that existed before death and exists beyond death and is multidimensional, multi-layered, and exists in those more I don't know, etheric realms or spiritual realms, and that animals, as humans do, have that, are that.
So, I mean, we'll talk more about it. I find it be interesting because this has been a debate in Western philosophy about animal souls for centuries, if not millennia. Um, and somehow it matters. That's kind of what I'm eventually getting at. Like, what does it really matter if they do or not? So my follow-up question to you would be, is this could be in a personal view too, is like, in that view, is the soul that you're talking about, does that soul think? Can that soul feel? Can that soul be harmed? Or is it immaterial? And it's really just this kind of rider, or immaterial presence inside the thing that feels, thinks, etc.
I would love to say yes, that well, that the soul remains, that a soul cannot be destroyed, given that it's energy, it's intelligent energy, and it remains untainted once out of the illusion of this physical life. Um, but it it speaks to our similarity, and that appeals to people when we talk about most people believe we have a soul, humans have a soul, and we are a soul, and yet their belief may stop at animals. And so I don't know. So what would be the best way to sort of engage them the way you're engaging me in this conversation that gets them to a vegan conclusion, sort of, or a kindness conclusion, or an ahimsa conclusion?
So it's well, now there's a number of questions, and I take blame for that because I'm the one that wrote them. So pivoting to at least mainstream themes in Indian philosophy is this divide over souls and non-souls, and even this kind of project towards liberation, right? Or nirvana, moksha, kaivalyam, these are all terms, this kind of uh, ascension, or at least removal from the cycle of birth and death, samsara. And that is the goal. This is what I meant earlier about maximizing the physical body, is that, Buddhists, Jains, and even, Hindus would say things like, look, these are just false desires. Any life that you aspire to, you've already lived once before. You have countless lives, and they're all been unsatisfying. That's why you're being reborn again. And what we're trying to do is to give you a path to avoid rebirth. This is what I always say in Jainism and other traditions. The problem isn't death. The problem is birth. They're trying to avoid rebirth. Why? Is because the world is shot through with dukkha, suffering, and no matter the positivity and the beauty and the wonderful things that you have in this life, they will not be kind of outweighed. It's always like net negative. And if you want to be free from them, then you seek a path, a spiritual path towards liberation from the cycle of birth and death. Now, the post-liberatory state is described very differently in different traditions, and it's very hard to kind of think about rationally. Like when they talk about, say, a liberatory state as being blissful, well, how is that blissful if I've ceased to have a mind or body anymore? What is experiencing bliss? Right. However, I guess the point is that um, classical yoga and Jainism, other traditions, believe in a soul that is immaterial and that is distinct from matter. So in classical yoga, they'll talk about Purusha and Prakriti, which is something. Purusha means like soul or self. Prakriti is nature. Jainism has a jiva, which is kind of this individual soul, and ajiva, things that are not jiva. Like I said earlier, the A is the negation of the thing. So Jainism has a interesting, they just say jiva and ajiva. So it's kind of like soul and non-soul. However, and then the kind of the Buddhists have their own situation, and the Buddhists have kind of maybe perhaps more branches of thought and disagreements than any of kind of the traditions that I would think about. But they generally don't accept the existence of a soul. Mostly you have these skandhas, they're called aggregates that are just kind of composite parts. And through the operation and the co-interaction or the interaction between those parts, we kind of conjure this notion of a soul. But it's something like a fabrication. And I think like most science these days, or most secularists, and especially say atheists or non-religious people might agree with this, that there's no such thing as a soul. All there is our kind of mind and our emotions. And somehow they're either fully captured by the brain, by matter, or there's some mind. I think mind is a strange, another strange topic we could talk about. And that from this, we create this notion of a soul. The Jains disagree, classical yoga disagrees. I will like to give a plug here for a whole tradition of thought in ancient India that tends to be overlooked, which are these secular skeptical materialists known as Charvaka or Lokayata. And I know I said I wouldn't get too technical to kind of alienate listeners, but I think we tend to exoticize and orientalize India a lot as being this just like nation of eternal spirituality amongst poverty. And it's just terrible work. Especially when people go to India and they romanticize its poverty. Often that's been exacerbated by the United States and global capitalism. But the point is that there has been long-standing a tradition of skeptics who say that there is no soul, karma doesn't exist, there is no rebirth. There are none of these things. And they actually make fun of the Jains. They make fun of the Buddhists. They make fun of Hindus. They make fun of the Vedic ritualists. And they are very much like what we would refer to as secular materialists today. They're not hedonists. They don't think like, okay, because there's no God or no karma, you can do whatever you want. I mean, we even have a little bit of evidence to think that they may have been vegetarian, but they also deny the existence of a soul. So I'm just kind of giving at least some of the terrain here. So whether or not I believe or traditions believe that animals have souls, there's also the question is if the soul is immaterial, what does it really matter? Because if when I commit acts of harm, and we're talking today about veganism and animal advocacy and so on, if I'm committing acts of harm, then, and I'm committing those acts against, say, the physical body and, say, the brain, which is at least in some way related to the nervous system as part of emotions, then harming those things, these material substances, that's the real concern. Because if the soul can't be harmed, then what does it matter if the being that I'm harming has a soul or not, right? It's strange to think, in my opinion, that because a being has a soul or can be reincarnated or whatever else, somehow that being matters. Because if the soul isn't what feels pain or feels unpleasantness, but the body, then I just need to be concerned with any sentient organism, regardless if they have a soul or not. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so, but to answer your question, in Jainism, yes, all animals have jivas, have souls. Classical yoga would agree. The Jains go further than any other probably tradition, religious tradition of India that I know of in ascribing souls even to microscopic organisms, what we would now refer to as something as microscopic organisms, which they call nigoda, which would be translated more as like microflora, like a microplant. But then they also talk about insects um, and all these other, insects, arachnids, and so on, that all have souls. And the question about, these vertebrates and what they refer to as five-sensed animals, fish, birds, mammals, and so on. Oh, that's not even a question. Not only do they have souls, but they actually have the same number of senses as human beings and are capable of many of the same experiences. To wrap that up, I don't know if there was another question at the end of it, but personally, do I believe in animals have souls? I would just say, do I believe that humans or animals have souls? Because they're one and the same question for me. I would say that I'm more of a Buddhist sympathizer personally, and a Charvaka sympathizer, a materialist sympathizer, where, I mean, the Buddhists still believe that there is rebirth, which is hard. In the absence of a soul, there is still rebirth.
Mm.
Um, because your kind of mind complex, your consciousness, and the storehouse of karma that you have is still able to connect to your next life. But they deny the existence of a soul. And so I'm sympathetic to that. But I'm also sympathetic to the Indian materialists who say there's no soul, there's no karma, there's just this world. And we still have an ethical responsibility in this world, but it's not because of all this kind of mumbo jumbo that the others are spouting. I
Yeah.
say mumbo jumbo is like that's what they would say. They would be pretty cutting about it.
Yeah. You say that, yeah, lovingly or humorously.
Yeah, I mean that no, I'm saying it's not me. I'm saying from
Oh,
this kind of materialist tradition of India, they would ridicule people who believe in all these things. I mean, I think what's kind of interesting, just if I'm allowed to kind of offshoot for a second, I do find it interesting how in the Western adoption of a lot of Indian ideas and practices, that critique of those practices uh, is met with this feeling that individuals are just being, say, Euro-American ethnocentric or not open or closed-minded. But I think a lot of people who came to yoga and meditation and Indian philosophy from Abrahamic traditions and Christianity have no problem enjoying the ridicule of Christianity, right? They think that, say, people who are, say, biblical literalists is kind of like wacky, right? But understand that from an ancient Indian tradition, these are individuals from their own location and tradition who are looking at people amongst them who believe in things that for them are hard to believe and calling it things like mumbo jumbo.
mm.
And for me, I actually really appreciate that because it bespeaks of how India, a country that has been exoticized and romanticized and abstracted, I think, in the minds of Western people, has like a long tradition of people who are just trying to like live a decent life, avoid suffering, care about others, be good people, even in the absence of karma, souls, and liberation.
Yeah, so all that you're saying is lots of food for thought and is designed as well, not designed, but it sparks more questions. I mean, like it just makes us have more questions, which is good. It is always good to be open-minded, and it is possible. One doesn't cancel the other out. You can have a firm belief that you believe and still be open-minded, right? And still be in the paradox of I believe this right now, and at the same time, I'm asking questions and I'm thinking with a critical mind and I can be skeptical and it doesn't cancel the other out and you're right, as humans we tend to anthropomorphize even God and spirit and all of that. We tend to project human characteristics into it, so we have to kind of watch for that as well, and we do that sometimes onto animals as well. But maybe the answer is whatever we believe, the answer is yes, and it's even more
I
than
want to say
that.
actually, but I want to pause, I want to intersect that. I think that's exactly. I just want to make this point kind of across the board. Absolutely, what you just
Oh, good.
described. This
Oh,
is how
good.
to have a conversation is how do you have a good conversation is yes and not no but, right? The vegan conversation is typical one is no but, and this is not respectful. It's not respectful of our own limited understanding, our own fallibility. Because you could be wrong about animals, right? I'm not saying you are, or like vegans could be wrong. I'm not saying they are, but they could be wrong. And so I've had conversation with friends a lot about like, yeah, there are situations where maybe the vegan choice isn't the right choice. And people get extremely defensive, unbelievably defensive, even at the mere suggestion. And before actually getting into the nuts and bolts of whether or not it's a true statement or not, what I'm what I notice is the amount of defensiveness that comes up right away, which feels like I'm so um, loyal to veganism that I can't even
Mm.
entertain the possibility that it's incomplete or misguided at times or inapplicable. Because this is the same kind of closed-mindedness that vegans get frustrated with when they encounter non-vegans.
Mm.
So I really appreciate that. Exactly. Yes, and.
Yeah. Yes, and. What was the other part? Yes and no but?
No, not no but. Don't use no but. Use yes and.
Okay, got it.
Which and also it's not sorry, it's just kind of reminding me a lot about conversations I've had. I haven't thought about a lot of these things in a long time, or some of these like kind of on the street actions, but I think vegans also have this weird anxiety that they're somehow acquiescing or conceding or being complacent with others
Yeah.
if they're not absolutely firm about their position right away, like in every conversation. And so it's not about a debate. It's not no, but no, that's not wrong. I'm going to tell you why it's wrong. I'm going to tell you why I'm right. Instead, it's yes, I hear you. I'm listening to you. I'm actually going to take this. And there's also this other view that might be different, that could be also valid, or perhaps more valid, or is the valid answer. But
Yeah.
I just appreciate that.
Yeah, and in the conversation of, materialist, there's no empirical proof of anything we were just talking about. And I fully admit that sometimes I like to believe what I believe because it gives me hope. It gets me up in the morning fighting for animals. The idea that they are unchanged as souls, or maybe the idea that they are the bodhisattvas, they are the wise sages and teachers chosen to be here in this shitty reality, to show us the best in us or to mirror back something. I love that. Maybe it just warms my heart, makes me feel better, and helps me to cope in that way. And I love that. I love to dive deep into near-death experiences. There are so
Mhm.
many amazing ones out there. You can read about them, you can watch the videos of them, and they bring me hope. And it resonates with me that the experience of dying is the same for animals and humans. I love to believe that as soon as we leave these bodies, we barely have any concern at all for the life we just left, and it is just epic love. That's what all the common denominator of every near-death experience I've ever learned about. Like that's the common. Everything else is different based on what they believe, maybe based on their own filters, in that way. But there's zero attachment to the life. And I like to imagine animals leaving, even when they're slaughtered, leaving their bodies and going, done with that, done, instantly done, like so done, back in their light bodies and back in love. And you're right. Does any of this really matter other than the curiosity and the feeling that it brings? What matters most, as we're saying, is this moment now, now, here, now, really is where we want to continue to circle our focus back to. But so speaking of that, I wanted to ask you, in terms of your experiences with animals, do you have this in the back of your mind when you're face to face with farmed animals? Any animals, especially animals, and what's been your most sacred and profound direct experience that you've ever had with an animal?
Yeah, I think with experiences, especially with farmed animals, the most striking aspect is for a lot of people who live, I'd say in the United States right now, is you really don't see animals around. I mean, most of the time, depending where you live, but the majority of people. Just reflecting on this, I mean, we just don't see them at all. We're kind of slowly pivoting to an animalist world. And I actually think for people who are not concerned about animals, this is causes them no problem whatsoever. The idea that we could say live in a world that has no animals. Now there might be animals that are away in slaughterhouses or other forms of confinement that are being produced for food, but you walk around. At least I'm in the city now, and I see stray cats, I see people with their dogs, I see birds. And because I'm in Philadelphia, you get quite a bit of raccoons and possum as well, at least in my neighborhood. But I think it's fascinating. I don't, that's the wrong word, really distressing, is the massive number of animals that are alive that we just like don't see. I mean, if 300 chickens are killed every single second in this country per second, then how, over 9 billion of them exist, and we don't see any of them. We just don't
Or
see them.
completely blind to them.
So when I go, I'm just using this as a kind of backdrop. So, when I started volunteering around 2016, when Love and Arms Sanctuary at the time was in Loveland, Colorado, was getting started, I think I first caught the glimpse of, right, the bittersweet reality of all sanctuaries, which is, wow, it's wonderful that these few animals are here that are not, say, being slaughtered. But in principle, this is a terrible place. These are just fugitives. I mean, I don't mean terrible in terms of treatment. I mean terrible in like that it exists.
Yeah.
These are camps. These are like
Yeah.
fugitive
They're
camps
like
for
refugees.
exactly that have nowhere. There is no place to go back to. Biologically, there's no place to go back to. Geographically, there's no place to go back to. So at Love and Arms, there's, one of their pigs, Felix, is still alive. I've known Felix for almost 8 years. But when they came in, Felix came with their brother Franklin, who, if you go to Love and Arms' site, Franklin's like just this kind of legendary pig that was there. And I met Franklin at one and was already hobbling from extreme arthritis, but was just like the gentlest, cutest, I don't know, 500-pound commercial pig. And I could probably reflect and go to individual animals, but I think the most sacred and profound experience is that these animals, their capacity for forgiveness is unbelievable, given what they've been subjected to. I mean, not to paint a bleak picture, what you said about kind of where animals live, it's like, but the reality is like the situation for most animals is they are in a hell realm and we're the devils. If they could draw hell, they would be drawing, as they say, humans would be their captors
We are the monsters.
and their executioners. And somehow cats, dogs, birds, rabbits, goats, pigs, cows can come from awful situations at the hands of humans. And somehow, maybe not right away, and maybe not all of them, but develop this capacity for trust and compassion and forgiveness. Um, we don't deserve it. We don't.
No.
And yet they do it. And I think this is part of it's not the explicit goal, I think, of animal sanctuaries, but when they say that they want people to come and have immersive experiences and meet animals one-on-one, I think part of it is um, for those few that go home having this kind of maybe nice contact with an animal and then reflecting and say, what did I do to even deserve that? I don't deserve that kindness from that animal, but somehow they've been able to muster it. And I find that to be remarkable, their capacity for love and kindness and even just the ability to kind of carry on um, is unbelievably inspiring.
Absolutely. I say the same things all the time too. We don't deserve them. They deserve better. We need to give them their own planet
Hmm.
where they're just left to their own flourishing world.
I
Um,
mean, I mean, I agree and disagree. I don't really think that we, you know, historically, so I like to be hopeful, but I also don't like to be so kind of like hopeful where I'm actually not paying attention to the reality of the issue, right? That the reality issue, sadly, is that almost every other entity on this planet would be better off if humans were not on this planet.
yeah.
That's a kind of a fact. It's not, I don't think it's a position, and it's extremely depressing. It depresses me all the time that like like we actually, I don't know how much good we actually give any of other sentient beings on this planet, minus like our little interactions, but our interactions are largely ones that are the product of exploitation, like pets, right? In certain ways. Now, I think there's some ways that I'm not so sure about that. I know people that live with cats, and I think cats have pretty great lives, actually. I mean, in certain ways. I mean, I would like the life of a cat sometimes, given all the things that they're generally guaranteed that on the streets, at least the streets around me, they're not guaranteed. But these are just small issues. But anyway, I think the idea that it's not about kind of separating animals, I think, completely. It's that how can we imagine, right, a society where we're living with animals,
Yeah. Side by side in harmony.
living with them.
Sharing the
Um,
earth. Yeah.
and But yes, I mean, my first instance is just like leave them,
Yeah.
kind of generally leave them alone until we can dedicate the kind of emotional capacity, intellectual capacity, and economic capacity to take them into account. But I do share that feeling too that you have, which is like, can't
Yeah.
we just leave them alone?
Yeah, I'm and I say it, part tongue in cheek, of course. In the ideal world would for them would be a world without without humans if we became extinct, perhaps,
Mhm.
and we're so far from that, so we do want to stay hopeful, of course, and we won't see utopia in our lifetime, but we don't want this very dystopian reality to continue for animals. But let's segue from there because I don't want to miss out on talking a bit about Arihanta Institute, which is how I came to you and found you. So, like, what is your role at Arihanta, and what is your mission and vision? What is the meaning of Arihanta, and
Great.
what courses and degrees are available?
So uh, I'm a professor of Jain studies and vegan studies at Arihanta Institute. Just my own background is I've uh, did my master's degree at CU in Colorado and then did my PhD in religious studies, South Asian religious studies at University of California, Santa Barbara. And then a few years later, joined Arihanta Institute. And I teach there, and I also, through them, am a visiting assistant professor at Claremont School of Theology, with whom we have a partnership. But Arihanta Institute, so Arihanta refers to basically someone who's achieved liberation. Another synonym would be like Arihanta means someone who has kind of killed or conquered the passions in a sense, a victor. That's what Jinnah. So a Jainism actually comes from Jinnah. A Jinnah is someone who has become victorious over the passions, or you could say victorious over the cycle of birth and death.
Mm.
And those who follow that path are Jains, Jain. And Arihanta Institute is a Jain Studies Institute. So we're a nonprofit private institution that's dedicated primarily to democratizing Jain studies, which means to help people learn about Jainism and its values for the sake of their, say, own intellectual interests, but also mostly for a better world, for what we refer to as kind of engaged Jainism, Jain practices in the world. I myself am not Jain, but as I always say, is I have, as we've spoken about, a lot of the shared values of the Jain tradition. And the Jains have always historically and in the contemporary period are open to that, meaning that it's not like you have to believe in karma or in souls or in other aspects of Jainism, but the core values, things like nonviolence, uh, non-possessiveness, open to various viewpoints, compassion, these are core principles in Jainism. And the Arihanta Institute is dedicated to offering courses not just on Jainism as a religious tradition, but also a lot of the issues that Jains and people who have these values are concerned about. So I was brought on board to teach about the Jainism, but primarily because of my background in religion and animals, religion and food, and vegan studies. So while we have a number of initiatives at Arihanta, I spearhead and lead the Vegan Studies Initiative, which is a series of courses, uh, talks, special events around what we're calling kind of vegan studies or issues around kind of veganism. So that could also be things such as uh, climate, the climate effects of industrial animal agriculture. It could be about kind of nonviolence and its application to animals. It could be, we have a course on kind of the greenwashing and humane washing in um, the kind of presentation of animal food systems. We have courses coming out kind of on the gendered and racial aspects of meat eating, meat production, and consumption. So a lot of things that really aren't even religious focused or Jain focused, but have to do with issues that Jains are concerned about. Because like I said, they're the longest enduring vegetarian community in the world. And they also have been practicing animal rescue and care for centuries, if not millennia. So we offer those things. And then also, as I said, we have a partnership with Claremont School of Theology, which means that we co-teach with some of the faculty at Claremont a master's degree in engaged Jain studies, which itself has a concentration in veganism, animals, and ecology. So if you join that master's program, it's like, it could be a 2-3 year long program. You study with myself. The other two faculty members from Arihanta are Kojin Bohannik and Christopher Jane Miller, who teach other aspects in Jainism or engaged Jainism. And the courses with me are generally about animals, veganism, ecology, as the kind of concentration announces. So that's what we do. We do a lot of other things. Like I said, I mentioned some online courses, but if you go to our website, you'll see how there's this entire catalog of courses that are self-paced courses, meaning they're asynchronous, they're video courses. You take them at your own pace in so many topics, and select courses like the one that we were in together, Michelle, for Lancaster Farm Sanctuary, also included live Q&A sessions. So some of our courses offer live Q&A sessions with the instructors. That's just kind of me running through a number of things, and you can just always reach out, and I'm happy to answer more questions from anyone.
Fantastic. Yeah, and I highly encourage folks to do that, to look you up, to check it out, to participate. And maybe folks will find something there that resonates for them the way you did. I see your writing and your teaching and your involvement with the Institute as a form of activism, your current form of activism that you have immersed yourself into. So I just give you, lots of credit for that. And I know we're going to look to wrap up now. So as we wrap up, though, I'm going to just throw it back to you for any final words, or I always like to ask my guests, what words of inspiration and encouragement do you offer to the next generation of activists?
Get involved. This isn't next generation. This isn't next generation of activists. This is you at home. These are vegans at home who are scrolling on Instagram or any other social media platform about the urgency, the immensity of harm and issues going on. Get involved. And when I mean get involved, I don't mean just for animals. What's going on in your local community that you can be involved in that is about addressing systems of oppression that always implicate animals? No matter, and not only should you just not be only considered about animals, but if you want something that is a kind of both and, then do that. Are groups around you organizing or labor organizing? Get involved. Are you talking about food redistribution? Get involved. Talking about the liberation struggle in Palestine or elsewhere? Get involved. Are you interested in trans issues and queer? Get involved. All of these people, you're sharing values. What individuals are missing is that, yes, some people, the animal question is, in my opinion, the hardest question. And we didn't talk about it in the podcast, but historically, the animal has always been framed as that which can be violated, that which can be killed, which is why we use the language of animalization, dehumanization, which means the figure of the animal is just so ingrained. It's going to be so hard to dislodge, and change is going to be so incremental. But what you can do is go around people who have shared values and get involved in those groups. Find community. It will give you hope. It will make you feel good. So much activism doesn't make you feel good, in my experience, right? It feels hard. It can feel draining. And this is why so many people experience burnout. So can you forge community even if people aren't on the level where you are with animals just yet? Because you know what? You probably have blind spots in other issues with which you will learn from others. Have you thought about the prison system, the way that other people are thinking about the prison system? Thinking about the United States of America? Have you thought about capitalism in the way other people are thinking about it? These are ways where you can also live your values. So I think that's one. And then the only other thing I'll mention is also think locally. Like, what are some things you can win locally? And I think this is a new turn in the animal movement as well. Is there's a lot of these like massive campaigns, and that's great. But I think what we learned from the the Shack campaign and other smaller campaigns is like, what can you do locally to get a win? Because wins are also sustaining,
Mm.
right? If you're constantly just doing protests and getting no change because they're just so big, then you just talked a lot, you wave signs, you go home, and it's business as usual elsewhere. So think about your community. What's something really small you can work on, whether it's changing things in dining halls or options elsewhere. And I know they feel really small, but I find those to be supporting and supportive in the long run.
Mm.
And in general, just like celebrate yourselves. It's hard work. Everyone's like really trying your best. It's really challenging. And um, don't forget to kind of celebrate your efforts. And in this one life, or maybe many lives, if you think that, you're dedicating yourself in ways, your time, your free time, your energy, your emotional bandwidth, and not just have compassion for yourself, but also just, celebrate that, celebrate your community, recognize your community. And I think to answer your question, that's what gives us hope and can have us experience joy even when we're involved in some of the darkest issues in some of the darkest times.
Beautiful. Thank you for bringing us to that place and reminding folks that even small actions make a difference, and stay engaged, become involved in your local community is such a great tip. And remember self-care. So I just want to take a final moment to sort of honor you as we wrap up. You need to know that your efforts and contributions to animal liberation do not go unnoticed. Your legacy will continue to fold forward and reach animals in the future, as well as inspire generations of activists to come. Your compassionate heart comes through in your work. So thank you on behalf of the animals, and thank you for being on the Animal Liberation Hour, Jonathan.
Thank you so much. It's been wonderful.
Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Jonathan Dickstein and that you are reflecting on the power of compassion and nonviolence in our journey towards a more ethical world. Every act of kindness and every choice made with empathy contributes to a future where all beings are treated with respect and dignity. If you enjoy the Animal Liberation Hour and would like to support our work, please consider joining AAC's Patreon. Even as little as $2 a month goes a long way in helping us expand our reach and increase our impact. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, where you can keep up with the podcast as well as everything AAC. You can sign up for a free mentor to help you with your activism at animalactivismcollective.com. Our work extends beyond mentorship to include collaborations and mutual support with other grassroots animal rights groups. So reach out to us to become part of the AAC community. Here's a reminder: the animals need you. Show up, speak up, and don't give up. Until next time, this is AAC signing off.